on my right, who will be delivering the lecture. Professor Della is Professor of Sociology at EUI and Professor of Political Science at Florence at the same time. She is, if you've looked at her CV, as I have, in great detail, it's made my eyes water. Donatella's work covers a really extensive range. For any of us who've worked in social movements, worked in the areas of contentious politics, who've worked in areas of corruption, Europeanisation, policing, democracy, and that's not it. But she covers all those areas and many more. She's a star scholar as far as we're concerned. It's a delight for us to have her talk today. She's author of too many books to mention, but I will mention one of them, which is Clandestine Political Violence, because that's the topic that she's going to present today. We're going to have a 50-minute lecture, and there'll be time for questions and answers afterwards. So, with no further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Donnatella Della Porta.
Thank you for these kind words, and thank you for this invitation. A friend who is in the audience told me, since when do political scientists invite a sociologist? And I hope not to disappoint the political science in the audience, since I've been always working in the two fields. I thought about talking of political violence in this recent book, since this is a lecture which commemorates one of the leading scholars on political conflict. And what I would like to do in this presentation is to talk about the substance of what I've called clandestine political violence, but also to talk about the methods, because for me this project was also a journey into a different type of approach to comparative politics, which I started to develop while I was reflecting on my research design. And so I thought it was appropriate to discuss it with this distinguished audience, also to try to learn from the questions that will be addressed to me. So my work for this book, and in general reflection on political violence, developed, now I don't see the PowerPoint, is there, yes, developed in steps, and started with a very in-depth case study of just one form of political violence in Italy, left-wing form of clandestine political violence. Developed a bit working on ethnic political violence, and then suddenly, since research on political violence tend to go in waves, developing especially on new challenges, or what are perceived as new challenges. I was suddenly confronted by many colleagues who asked me to discuss more recent instances of violence than the one I had studied in the 80s in Italy. For instance, when September 11th, the attacks happened with about 3,000 people who died in coordinated suicide attacks. People started to ask me to comment, and I was wondering if these forms of violence had anything to do with the ones I'd studied in the past. 10 years after those attacks that have been labeled as attacked by fundamentalist religious groups, another tragic events happened in Norway, where almost 100 of young people were killed by a right-wing terrorist. And once again I was asking myself, do they have anything in common, these attacks, with the one I had studied by the Red Brigades and with the one I had studied by the ETA, the Basque nationalist movement. And this started also a sort of methodological reflection. Do they have something in common? Acts of political violence coming from the left, from the right, from religious, from nationalist type of groups acting on very different aims? Do they represent sort of sociological or political science concept that is worth comparing? My initial answer was very hesitant, because I thought that there were too many differences. Thinking in terms of traditional causal type of analysis is what's clear that the type of quality of democracy versus authoritarian regimes under which some of these forms have developed were quite different. The type of economic conditions were very different. The type of purposes this group addressed was very different. And I was accustomed in political science to try to compare the like with the like. So to a type of comparative research design which has provided very rich type of evidences. My question is now, should we go beyond this type of model? Should we also try to compare what is not really the like with the like, but trying to break rigid borders between sub-disciplines in the field and try to see to which extent something that we assume is very different nevertheless may follow similar type of causal mechanisms. So I started to be also frustrated by the fact that many of these phenomena tended to be addressed by different subfields in the disciplines. Left-wing political movements very often under the label of social movements, which is the label or the field I've been most familiar with. Ethnic forms of political violence are studied by people working on nationalism very often. The radical right is very often addressed by people looking at micro-dynamics of deviance. And religious forms of political violence were considered as something different from all the rest. Studied either by area specialists of the Middle East or often by sociology of religion or subfields that had not communicated very much with other subfields in the disciplines. The idea to compare the like with the like tended to follow a research design which applied to the small n, small number of cases, a similar logic to the one which was developed for statistical type of analysis, with a limit though. That in a small number of cases you tended not to apply a probabilistic research design, but more a deterministic logic. So this was a bit of a push, this type of reasoning, to move beyond a comparative analysis of most similar cases, and to see what would happen if different forms of political violence were to be compared, the one with the other. This was my sort of pull type of motivation in adventuring in trying to see to which extent what I'd studied on the left-wing forms of political violence and on ethnic violence could be useful also in order to understand most recent waves. But there was also a sort of push type of factor. I'm not seeing the slides, so I hope I'm giving you the right one. The pull factors which oriented me toward this research was that as in many waves of research on extreme forms of political violence, there was always the idea that the ones we were facing was the worst, that it had no possible comparison with the previous one. A very widespread discourse is religious forms of political violence are more extreme than ideologically driven ones, forgetting very often Nazism or Stalinism in this type of statement. Nationalism had been considered as the most disruptive because it followed a sort of irrational logic. But then the religious one was considered once again as the worst and unique one. So there were books after books and articles after articles addressing new terrorism, the new wave of terrorism, with the idea that it was more lethal and indiscriminate than the other forms in the past. That it was more fanaticism-oriented, because it had not negotiable type of aims. That it was a particularly difficult one to address because it had used a sort of network type of forms through which Al-Qaeda in particular had penetrated in all Western societies through a use of new technologies and new organizational forms. All this was mainstream stereotypes, but also there were emerging research which seemed to challenge this type of statement. More lethal, of course, September 11 produced more victims than many other forms of political violence. But if you compare the attacks in London with the attacks by the radical right at the railway station in Bologna in 1980, the number of victims were on the same range. Use of new type of arms was not new technologically developed arms was not so typical of the religious groups. It had been used by sects in Japan, but not by the Islamist religious groups. Also, the logic of these new forms of political violence was unclear. The religious basis for these forms of attacks has been discussed and challenged by scholars who suggested that behind the religious languages, what is often at stake is a struggle of, let's say, liberation from occupied countries or occupied areas. And also in terms of organizational forms, type of networks which have been considered as typical of the new fundamentalist groups were really there already before. There have been always a way through which politically violent groups have tried to escape the repression by the state. So to which extent these forms of political violence was really new and something different was, I thought, open to empirical type of research. And this pushed me to towards this subtitle I gave to the lecture and the book, Global Comparison. I don't mean to say that all comparative politics should go in the directions of comparing different things, but I think that it shouldn't either be constrained by the other logic to develop only through area studies and to focus only on very constrained type of phenomenon. In the study of political violence, like in research in many other areas, what had been quite common, bringing about interesting results, had been the traditional two models of research design. Large N research on a large number of countries, which had been, however, very constrained, on the one hand by the lack of reliable indicators on the type of violence, and on the other hand by the lack of valid indicators for many types of dimensions one wanted to investigate. And so this type of research design, which included different types of countries, could, however, not go beyond some reflections on general causes. The other model which was used a lot was small n analysis of different types of violence in left-wing, right-wing, ethnic, religious, and so on. They had produced a lot of very important information on these events, but on this phenomenon, but very often with a lack of communication between the different fields, so that one didn't know really to which extent the apparent diversity in the analysis were reflecting real diversity between the phenomenon, or just a different type of bias or stereotypes or preferences that develop in each field, in each different model. So there was a limited level of generalizability, but also accumulation of results. And what I tried to develop, and this is the proposal I would like to discuss with you now, is a different model, which is small n, so small number of cases, comparing small number of political violent organizations, but which at the same time tend to compare diverse forms of political violence. So what is usually considered a most different research design. This, however, is a bit of a challenge, comparing very diverse forms of political violence. Yes. It went to the next. And the problem for me then was conceptualization. Chastili stressed the need for social science definitions to point to detectable phenomenon that exhibits some degrees of causal coherence. That is, when we construct a concept, what it is important is that we are putting forward a type of phenomena which can be analyzed together because they exhibit some degrees of causal coherence. So I don't think that one could try to explain all the different types of violence. Someone once wrote trying to explain with the same model riots, terrorism, or spontaneous type of violence is like looking for the same causes for widespread phenomena like the existence of holes or sicknesses. So what I suggest in the book is to attempt at least to conceptualize something which I think exhibit some degree of causal coherence. And so what I want to present today is the research I've done on one specific form of political violence. What has been often labeled as terrorism, but I don't like the term terrorism because it tends to reify some specific characteristics of the use of some specific forms of actions by groups that usually have a broader repertoires. And what I'm instead focusing upon is, in my definition, violence by small groups who use extreme forms of violence, who address symbolic type of targets, so distinguish it from other type of violence which is aiming instead to military victory. But especially what I think constitute this essence of the concepts I want to put forward is the fact that these groups work in the underground, they are clandestine. What I discovered during the work, and it was my bet to a certain extent when I started to address these groups, to compare these groups, is that one of the sociological characteristics of the group which we usually call a terrorist group, and which tends to have an influence on the ways in which they developed, is their choice to go underground, is the leaving the open public spheres of politics and retreating into clandestine forms of violence. So when I worked on Red Brigades, ETA, the Basque case, the radical right terrorism in Italy, and the Al-Qaeda, comparing them, what I wanted to see was to which extent there was this degree of similarity linked to the factor of the being underground type of groups. And my specific bet and the specific suggestions which comes from this speech is that this group can be analyzed as sort of development of social movement organizations that have met some particular conditions in their environment and which decided in longer or shorter time to go underground. And that the way in which these groups developed is then defined and partly determined by the very fact of abandoning the traditional forms of actions of political activism and declaring a sort of war to the state. So my bet, or my hypothesis, let's call it in this way, was that in all these forms I could see at the same time, in the beginning, at the onset, the development of similar type of conflicts that brought about these underground organizations through intense relationships between different types of actors. And that, nevertheless, once these groups went in the underground, specific type of sociological mechanisms developed, so that these groups, which appear as very different to each other, developed following the same type of logic. The armamentarium, the toolkit I had at my disposal in order to try to understand these groups was to a large extent the one one can derive from social movement studies I was most familiar with, which tend to explain conflicts by locating them within the broader context of normal politics, and to look at the ways in which these interact with each other. So I thought, of course, social change, the type of resource which are mobilized by the groups, the type of political opportunities they found in their environment, they are all important. And important is the way in which they frame their own type of visions of the enemy and of the self. I tried to adopt this model, but with some caveats. I think, first of all, and this is something which I think is true of many of the political phenomena that we analyze, although it is easy to develop a causal logic, to think in terms of causes and effects, independent variables and dependent variables, what we really see in action usually is the fact of phenomena which constantly interact with each other. So groups that engage in political violence could have been pushed by certain closures in the political system, but then they interact constantly with this political system. So it is an artifact to consider them as the dependent variables, because in the 10 years of life of the Red Brigades in Italy, or in the even longer life of Al-Qaeda, there has been a constant interactions between these groups and their environment. It is not easy to single out causes and effects, because on a daily basis, let's say, the different phenomena have affected each other. So that's violence had an effect on framing, had an effect on political opportunities, had an effect on the mobilizing structures, and changed the environment. This is true of many phenomena. This is particularly true of violence, because as Mark Basinger has observed in his very interesting book on the breakdown of the Soviet Union, violence represents an intense moment, dense of emotional impact, so that it produces significant changes in the environment. Basinger has distinguished between the normal moment of development of nationalism and what he calls thick moments, the moments in which there are riots in the streets or political violence organized underground. And what he observes is that, of course, these are located within a context, within a long history. But to a certain extent, they also develop out of contingency and relations, interactions, which happen on the moment. And this is all the more true for clandestine political groups, which represents a moment of conversions, of changes, of intense, with an intense symbolic type of impact. And this is, I think, an important type of correction to the type of models which are usually utilized also for the analysis of social movements, causes and effects. What I tried to do, and what is my proposal for interpretations of this type of groups, is that first of all we need a relational type of approach. Political violence is the deed of clandestine groups, or sometimes not clandestine groups, but it is also the outcome of interactions of very different actors. Not only those who act underground and those who repress them, not only the terrorists and the police, but also there is a very intense type of competitions within a series of spheres in which this group emerged. So the analysis of political violence, I think, must be relational in the sense of locating the development of the most radical groups within the interactions of the many actors that intervene in the political field. What I found extremely important in all these different forms of actions is that in order to understand the choices of the most radical groups, one should also look at the intense competition within the social movement sectors itself, between groups that are similar to each other, but also very often between different social movements. So in order to understand the development of political violence in the Basque countries, one cannot look only at the competition between ETA and the PNUB, but within the ethno-nationalist social movements. But one should also look at the competition between nationalist discourse and the class discourse, and at the competitions between ETA and violent groups which contrasted ETA from the radical right. Even more complicated is when you look at the Middle East and North Africa areas where Al-Qaeda has its roots, and where, as it emerges with evidence also now during the Arab Spring, the competition is not only